9. The Savior Returns. Written by Celestial Rainstorm. Narrated by AJ the Elementalgod. Chapter 9. Event Horizon. Many miles away, the Stitchpunk Coven resided in Nine's hideaway, completely unaware of what was coming after them. They were all trying to find their place in life again, trying once more to share a home. Nobody was sending someone else away again, or leaving those who needed them. Some felt as if they'd never been apart at all. One seemed like he didn't know what to do with himself. He was a general, an enforcer of war. But now that it was all peace, what were he and 8 good for now? The oldest Stitchpunk usually kept to himself, away from the others, hiding in the highest room of the house. He rarely spoke to anyone. However, he had immediately resumed the role as leader as soon as 9 returned his crown, cape, and staff to him. One had accepted these gifts without so much as a thank you, but the younger didn't press the issue. Perhaps as time passed, he would earn one's respect, and maybe one day, his friendship. 8 never missed a chance to rub someone up a bit. One day he had been sharpening his sword on a slab of rock, a bored expression on his face. An excited 6 had rushed by and tripped over his idly outstretched foot. 8 snarled and picked up the frightened 6 by his key and lifted him off his feet. The bodyguard menacingly growled, "Watch where you're going, Stripes," then roughly put him back on the ground, leaving poor 6 unhurt, but visibly shaken. However, the Stitchpunks all seemed more at ease. Those that had come back to life were getting used to living once again. 9 was trying to get used to having everyone around him, talking to him. The smallest of noises frightened him. He still struggled with his nightmares. Sometimes it startled him. Suddenly, seeing 2 around the corner, or 5 coming up to greet him, he'd never seen everyone together except for those final moments when he'd released them. It was surreal, but he found it was becoming more comfortable being amongst his kin. It gave him a sense of security, and he felt happier than he had ever had. He would just have to adjust to keep reminding himself that the war was over. Despite being content, 9 couldn't stop feeling troubled. He watched 5 and 2 start talking about what they were going to build, 6 still keeping to himself, but seemed placid with sitting quietly by his friends and drawing. 7 and the twins were always around their friends, smiling and laughing. 9 found it hard, impossible to join them sometimes. They'd known each other for years, formed bonds that could never be broken. He'd only been alive for a few months, and could only stand on one side, silent. While he watched his friends sit together, laughing and talking cheerfully before walking away, he didn't feel like he belonged in that laughter, like he wasn't meant to. However, he still managed to join in the conversation sometimes, reveling in the feeling of having his friends back. There was something else, though. What was far more disturbing to 9. Why couldn't the 5 slain ragdolls move on? Their mission should be over, yet it wasn't. Once, while he watched 5 tinkering, handing him his tools, 9 had asked him why that was. 5 could only pause, apologizing to say that he had no idea either. The mysterious being that had told him that they needed to come back and disappeared, and never appeared to them again. He reassured his friends before asking him to hand him a wrench. So 9 tried to forget about this. His friends were back now, and everyone was happy. He found himself more content than he had ever before in his short life. Nevertheless, the strange feeling kept bothering 9, and he wondered what was going on. Around 3 weeks after the resurrection, it was a darker day than usual. The clouds that hovered above high in the sky created a dark gray, almost black ceiling over the world. 9 was sitting quietly inside the house on a desk leg propped against the wall. He was bent over the talisman, cleaning it with a piece of cloth he had salvaged from the ruins. The object was virtually useless now, but was strangely important to him. He didn't exactly know why, but yet it was. Some sort of strange instinct urged him to keep it. "Hey," Seven's voice greeted him as he looked up. She was walking towards him, and he slid over to make room for her. She sat beside him. "Oh, hi, Sev," he replied, a bit jadedly, setting the cloth down beside him and unzipping his chest. He reached up and put the talisman back, but Seven placed a hand on his. The male Stitchpunk looked curiously at her. "Why did you keep it?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, and that made Nine feel better. He paused and held the talisman before him. "Well, I'm not sure exactly, but I feel as if it was important, and it felt like they were still with me," he replied quietly, placing the talisman inside his chest and unzipping himself up. Seven looked up at him curiously. "They're back now, and it's done," she said, her brows furrowing slightly. "They're here now." "I know. It's not something I take for granted. I know that if we die, it's forever. It's just, I'm worried about what Five said. He said that they were trapped because they were unable to move on, because our mission isn't over. I don't know what that means for us. I want it to be okay," Nine said, staring fixatedly at the ground and sighing. Seven patted his shoulder gently. "I'm not sure what it means either, but we're together now," she replied softly. He smiled up at her, grateful for the reassuring of her kind words. "Now come on. You look lonely," she said, getting to her feet, gesturing for him to follow. Together they walked through the hallways to the drawing room where the others were resting, talking, or playing. The twins were light-heartedly pestering Six. He had been sitting on his knees, quietly drawing, and they kept talking, taking persistent pictures of him. When he decided to try to playfully catch them, they evaded his grasp, pulling on his key and tousling his hair from behind. Nine smiled at this, watching for a mere moment. And anxiously, the anxiety and fear drifted away. He couldn't help but steal a glance down at Seven, who stood beside him. He smiled even wider, a lovely warm feeling in his heart. Suddenly he felt an odd burning sensation coming from inside his torso. He started and touched his abdomen tenderly. It burned the tips of his fingers. It felt as if time had stopped, and he realized immediately it was the talisman. He quickly turned away and ran from Seven, and the others' apprehension took it over, and he caught the rest of the clan's attention. "Nine?" Seven called and ran after him. Nine stood beside the book of his room, hidden away from the others. He unzipped himself, pulling out the talisman and staring at it, eyes wide. The burn immediately disappeared from his abdomen, but now his palms were hot from holding the talisman. A bright light flashed in his eyes. 3 symbols on the front and the 3 holes on the bottom were glowing. Nine's breathing was heavy and uneven. He stared at the talisman, feeling as if the world was spinning down into darkness once more. Something was coming. It had to be. Why else would the talisman be glowing? The symbols pulsated gently like a beating heart. His heart plummeted, and his eyes grew even wider as his face was illuminated by the familiar eerie green glow. "No, no," he breathed, his hands trembling, nearly dropping the talisman. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. They had defeated the machines. And their world was safe again. He just got his friends back. His clan was safe. They had to be. "Nine, what is it?" Seven said firmly, finding him and rushing to him, looking over to her shoulder and horrified. There's something out there," Nine said quickly. He thrust the talisman into his chest, no longer caring about the burning sensation. He looked around and reached out, grabbing his life staff, and ran past the dumbstruck seven, out of the house into the broken world. 9 halted in the clearing where he had brought the 5 souls back to Earth. His eyes searched space around him, desperately, frantically hoping that the talisman was just having some sort of dormant mechanical issue. That they were alone. That something wasn't hunting them again. The morning was so cold that his breath came out as misty puffs before him. But the chills that they were sent through his body were nothing compared to his fright of his clan. He closely scanned the world around him. Holding his light staff high, he paused over niches of caves in the concrete and debris that surrounded the house, trying to find whatever it was. Nothing was there, and it was entirely silent. He listened intently for any sound around him. His only answer was the whistling of the wind and strangled breathing. Suddenly, there was an echo of groaning metal, loud and obvious in haunting forever silence. 9 jerked his head from side to side, startled by the noise. It grew louder and louder, then abruptly stopped, leaving a faint echo. 9 blinked, his heart hammered against his chest. He looked to all sides of him for the source of the noise. Then he froze in horror, realizing that whatever it was right behind him. 9 whipped around on his heel as a gigantic set of razor claws came crashing down upon him. They threw him off his feet and pinned him to the ground, knocking the light staff out of his hands. His eyes snapped open and found himself staring into the glowing blood-red eyes of the spine machine. He gave a cry of horror. This monster was terrifying. Horns adorned its head, mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth, claws long and piercing. His heart seemed to stop as the machine towered over him. Its eyes burned with an eerie, terrible fire that seemed to turn 9's very soul into ashes. 9 tried to struggle out of the machine's grasp, but it just held him there tightly, bearing down upon him. Its presence, its claws to its chest, crushing him against the ground. He gave a gasp out of it, cut off its breathing. The razor-toothed jaws opened slowly, suddenly screeched louder as the spear rammed into its skull, making a slight dent just underneath its right eye. Shaking its head, it looked up and roared at 7, who had arrived at the scene. Her skullman was pulled over her face, and her shield held over her head. She ran to the monster. She abruptly dodged the claws of the beast that tried to clip her. She went to retrieve her spear, which had landed on the ground. The spy machine then paused, its free claw raised slightly. Both of these small things were the scientist. They had a piece of his spirit inside of him. He looked from the small male, then to the female, who was trying to pull the other one from underneath its claws. The spy machine sensed the talisman right underneath it, then zeroed in on the device. It was inside the struggling thing underneath its claws. It had called for the talisman once it had realized it had been activated. It had answered. This thing, whatever it is, was the one it needed. The piece of the scientist had the talisman it needed to keep the fabrication machine alive, and the soul to straighten it. Now the spy machine would be able to get half its heart back. It whipped around its tail in anger, snarling at the two. The female ragdoll continued to try to get the male out from underneath its claws. The spy machine lunged at her and swung a huge horned head towards her. The very sharp tip of the longest horn clipped 7 to the side of her head, causing her to let go of 9's hands and fall into the ground with a cry. As the tail whistled through the air, it struck 5, who had run towards the commotion in the chest. He fell to the ground as well as he crumbled heap, winding his crossbow falling from his hands. "No!" 9 cried, trying once more to struggle out of the machine's iron grasp and get to his friends. He thrashed around fiercely, trying to see if 7 and 5 were hurt. The machine, however, screeched at him once more, irritated. It closed its claws around his middle, lifting him from the ground, then slammed him down with so much force it knocked him unconscious immediately. The spy machine then pointed its muzzle towards the house, opening its jaws and blew a strong string of fire all upon it. A showering of sparks fell to the earth as a veil of flames immersed the house. There, that sound take care of any other parts of the scientists. That should take care of any other parts of the scientists. The fire engulfing the house, and 7 opened her eyes to see her home ablaze. She gasped as the smoke surrounded her, blocking her vision. She could no longer see the machine, except for the glowing of its eyes. The spy machine gave a snort, bent down and picked 9 up in its jaws, holding his limp body tightly. The razor-sharp teeth nearly cut through his burlap skin. Its triumphant roar could be heard over the fire as 7 leaped to her feet, trying to find the others through the smoke. Suddenly 5 appeared with the twins, holding his hands and coughing. The others were all following him, clinging to each other. 7 led the group out of the suffocating cloud of black smoke. Burning embers fell to the ground around them, smoke rising into the air. They turned to watch their home go up in flames, horrified and shocked that another monster had attacked them. Although the 6 others were thoroughly covered in ash, they were fine, and none worse for wear. They then turned around and saw the machine bounding away, its 2 long legs flying through the emptiness to the distant hills. Everyone shook with fright, holding to each other and trying to overcome the shock. Another machine had attacked them, was now hunting them. It was starting all over again. 7 blinked, confused. Why was there another monster running away instead of picking the defenseless Stitchpunks one by one? She glanced over at the others, making a quick head count. She suddenly started looking all around and clearing desperately. 9? Where's 9? She exclaimed to the others. I thought he escaped, 5 cried, whirling around to 7. The thing had him pinned. I tried to get him out, but it knocked me out of the way. I didn't see him. After that, her sentence trailed off as she realized what happened. It took him, 5 whispered in horror, his eye growing wide, his lower lip trembling as he looked into the distance where the monster had disappeared. The others followed 9 and 7, looking into the distance. The machine had disappeared, along with the young male. The twins buried their faces in 2's shoulders, crying. He held them tightly, standing still in the stock. 7 looked to the ground and saw the light staff laying in the rubble. She walked over to it and picked it up gently. The bulb now had a small crack on the glass. She looked at it as she stood, and 5 came to stand beside her. 7 stared down at the staff while 5 placed a hand upon her shoulder. At this touch, she looked up at him, a deep, resolute look in her eyes. She held the staff in her hands as she would her own spear, and looked to the horizon. 5 followed her gaze. She knew what he was with her. Even if they had to do it alone, they were going after him. End of chapter 9.